Hello, good morning everyone. Welcome to this month's Connect with Control-M. My name's Ted Levitt and I'm a lead technical support analyst with BMC Software. I've been supporting Control-M on the mainframe and distributed systems for about over 16 years now. Today we'll be discussing the workload automation client connectivity. I know many of you have probably faced a situation where you've gone to the GUI and tried to connect and gotten a message saying unable to connect for one of these various reasons, and we're going to be talking about that and diving in. I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce a few of my other panelists. I have Brian Looney and Froylan Reyes on from support and Avi Karmun on from our level 3 team as well. I'd like to briefly run through our agenda. I'm going to start with some concepts regarding client connectivity in the Enterprise Manager, how it works. Going to be discussing how to configure the Enterprise Manager server and work the client connectivity there, and then go over a few scenarios that we encounter frequently with our customers. I'd like to take the opportunity to remind everyone that if they have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A panel and put your question to all panelists, and we'll cover it at the end of the session. You can also save the presentation if you'd like to by going to File and Save, and you can save that as a PDF. Moving in right into the architecture here, I'd first like to explain how the client and server work together. The client can be either the workload automation GUI, the reporting facility, or the configuration manager. The first thing that the client does when it's launched is it attempts to connect to the Enterprise Manager naming service. When it connects to this naming service, which is essentially, you can think of it as a DNS, it provides to the client the host and port of the server that it's going to connect to. This host and port is the endpoint. And all of this intercommunication is done via Corba, which is essentially the framework that the client and server use, or the different components use to speak to each other. And we'll be discussing these a little later as well. In terms of configuring the Corba, the client-server connectivity, we have a couple of tools. The first is the orb configure, which is the graphical interface. I have a screenshot on our right, and we'll be demonstrating this later. This is the tool that we would recommend you use. There's the orb admin utility, and this is a command line utility that allows you to configure as well as to check status, stop and start the naming service, and perform various diagnostics. It's very useful. We'll be getting more into that in the different scenarios. In terms of the configuration and the function of the client and server, we have here in the etc domains directory under the Enterprise Manager installation the config.xml file. We'll be taking a look at this. And this is the file that stores the configuration information for the Enterprise Manager Corba. And then we'll have the var directory. The var directory is essentially the cache of the naming service that stores where the components are registered. Now, we've identified 4 different scenarios that we're going to get into here and discuss with you how to troubleshoot and configure for these environments. The first scenario I'd like to discuss is that where a firewall is between the client and server, and there's specifically a port range that's available to you through this firewall. In this example, we're given a range of 17,000 to 1720. And what we're going to be doing is using the orb configure utility to configure the Enterprise Manager to use that port range, and then use the orb admin utility to verify the configuration. At the bottom of the slide, I've included some orb admin command lines that you can use as an alternative to the orb configure utility. But we would generally suggest using the orb configure utility if you can. It's a lot less problematic generally than running the command lines themselves. I'm going to pop over to my desktop where I'm going to do this. Now I have the Enterprise Manager installed on a Linux machine, but what I'm going to be doing is going to be very similar between Unix and Windows. The GUI is going to look the same. I'm running an X server on my PC, so that's what you need. Otherwise, the commands will be nearly identical. So I'm going to start as my Enterprise Manager user, and then what I'm going to do is first run the orbadmin NSList utility here, and this is going to show you that the naming service is currently running. It's going to show where it's running. In here, it's on this host, WLA-con-RH on port 13,076. And then it's showing that I have a configuration server running with a specific endpoint, and then a GUI server running on another endpoint. And you'll notice that these do not fall within the range of our firewall rule. I'm going to go next to the config.xml file and show you a couple of things that I'd like to focus on. We aren't going to be editing this file, but I think it's important to know a little bit about what's going on. The highlighted line I have here shows the naming service on that port that we saw in the orbadmin NSList running on this host, 13,076. And then again in the scope NS, we see the same on 13,076. Now we're going to be changing this file. Because we're changing this file, I'm going to make a backup of it. Always a good idea to back up a file before you change it, just in case you need to revert back. So once I have done that, I'm going to actually kill my Enterprise Manager components that I have running in the background here to simulate a scenario where these crashed, and we'll be doing this as sort of a troubleshooting exercise here. So I've killed our GUI server and configuration server there. My next step before I'm going to be configuring it, and this is what we do normally, is I'm going to use orbadmin NSStop to stop the naming service. Next, I'm going to run the orb configure utility to launch the GUI to configure it. Now, what we're specifically concerned with here, since we're dealing with ports in a firewall, is we're going down to the setup listen ports. And I'm going to change this from random to range. In the port range, I'm going to select port 17,001 to port 17,020, and then click the next button. The second portion is our naming service, and this before, as we noticed, was running on port 13,076. We need to change this as well to exist in our port range. So I've selected 17,000 here. Going to click Next and be presented with a summary. And here we can see again our naming service is running on port 17,000, and our different components are in this port range of 17,000 to 17,020. I'm going to click Finish, and that has updated our config XML. And we're going to take a quick look back at our config XML, and we're going to take a look at those specific lines that we referenced earlier. We can see here the name service has changed to port 17,000 from 13,076. We can see a new variable that is entered with the listen endpoints starting at 17,001 with a port span of 20. And then in the scope NS, we see a port 17,000. I'm going to quit out of this. And then the next thing I'm going to do is start up my naming service that I had stopped before I had changed the ports. I'm going to start this, and then I'm going to, I don't have any components running now, but I'm going to do an orbadmin NSList, which is going to show me those items which are registered. Okay, so here we see the naming services running where we want it to run on port 17,000, but we see here that there are two components that are sticking around on these original endpoints that we had prior to killing them. Since they were killed or they had crashed, they didn't have an opportunity to unregister themselves from the naming service. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to clean this up. And before we do any cleanup, we're going to stop the naming service. And then we're going to change directory to the var directory. And we're going to make sure we're in the var directory because it's very important because we're going to be removing these files. So once we're in the directory, we did an ls, made sure the files we see are name service files. We're going to remove the contents of this directory, again, only this directory. Once this is done, make sure there aren't any files there, and we're going to start back up the naming service. Once we do this, I'm going to check the listing again. We should see no components registered because nothing started. And in fact, there's nothing registered here. So the next thing I'm going to do is start the configuration server and then start by hand the GUI server. It's just faster this way since I don't have to deal with the configuration manager or anything. Now, these have had an opportunity to start up, and we can check the listing again using the orb admin NSList, and we can see here that since we've changed the configuration and restarted the components, they're now, the endpoints are within the range of that we specified in the orb configure utility. We have port 17,001 and 17,003, 17,004 for the GUI server. So everything is in the right place. Going to exit out of this, and I'm going to talk about our next scenario. Next scenario I'd like to cover is the cluster or virtual name. In this example, we have a host that's running the enterprise manager, and this can be, for example, in a high availability cluster or somewhere where we're going to be running the enterprise manager on any number of machines and carrying over the disk or data from one machine to another. We've selected a virtual name or an alias, in this case WLA con-vipm. And what we're going to do is use the orb configure utility to set this virtual name, and we're going to use the orb admin utility to verify that we've set it correctly. I've placed some commands at the bottom of the slide, which are the equivalent of the orb configure utility. Generally, we would suggest using the graphical interface as it's less error-prone, but those commands will do the equivalent. I'm going to pop over to my screen, and I am going to become my enterprise manager user. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is show you that this name, if I ping it, will actually resolve to a host name. In this case, it's aliased to the WLA con-rh, but this is essentially going to behave identically to if it was a DNS alias or a virtual name. Next thing I'd like to demonstrate is that the naming service and its components are actually running and bound to that physical host name to begin with. These are running all on the WLA con-rh, which is my physical host name. This is what we're going to be changing. So since we're going to be changing things, we're going to go to the etc domains directory. The file that we're going to be changing is the config XML. So I'm going to make a backup of this file before we change it. And then I'm going to shut down my configuration server and my GUI server using command line. I'm using the CTL utility to do this with a command of stop. And now I'm going to run the orb admin NSList utility again. And since our components have been stopped, they've had an opportunity to unregister themselves, and we can see that they're no longer registered. Next thing I'm going to be doing is running the orb configure utility. Since we've already made a backup, we should be good in making changes from this point forward. First, I'd like to talk about the listen address. This is the address to which the naming service binds, we typically leave this all, which means all interfaces, it'll show up in a netstat as 0.0.0.0. It's typically safest to leave this at all, so we're not going to change this. What we are going to change is the published address. This is the name that the naming service will tell the client that it's running on, and what the client will attempt to connect to. So we're going to change this to our virtual name or alias. We're then going to select the next button, and here we're presented with the naming service configuration. And here we're going to change the host name from our physical host name to our alias or virtual name, and then click Next. We're going to ignore that. And one thing I did forget, and I apologize, is I actually had forgotten to stop my naming service, which I'm going to do right now. And then I'm going to pop back over. That was that warning. If we go back and then we click Next again, we will not receive a warning. So this is something that tells you that the port is in use or the naming service is running. We generally won't want to run any configuration utility while the naming service is running, because if we do, we won't be able to talk to it or tell it to stop afterwards. If I had run that orbadmin stop after having changed the configuration, it would not be able to contact the naming service to stop it. So we've checked the host names here for the naming service and the domain. Both are set to the mvip, and we're going to click Finish. We're now going to start again the naming service, and we're going to check the naming service and ensure that it is actually running, naming service running on the EM VIP. And now we're going to start our configuration server and our GUI server by hand. And now that these have had an opportunity to run and register themselves, we're going to do an orbadmin list. And we can see in the orbadmin list that the endpoints are registered on that alias or virtual name. So this is where they will be. Now, as a note, if you are running in a cluster, it would be good to reference the installation for clusters portion of the installation guide. There are some additional considerations for clustering, including setting an environment variable so that for example, the configuration agent, if you're using one, will be able to recognize and start and stop components on that virtual name if the components have been defined to use that virtual name. All right, so I'm going to exit and clear up. The next scenario I'd like to talk about is the VPN. And in the situation we're dealing with here was we have users that are connecting remotely to the company's network via VPN, and they're using the Enterprise Manager. They're not on the network itself, but connected through some external means. Since the Enterprise Manager 6401, this really shouldn't be an issue, but what we're going to do is we're going to perform some connectivity troubleshooting here using the Telnet and orbadmin utilities. I'd like to pop over to my desktop, and we'll go through this and make sure that we're able to connect. So I'm going to change over to my Enterprise Manager user and show the components that are running. So we see the naming service running on this physical machine at port 13077, and we see an endpoint on that same machine at 52576, and we see another, the GUI server, at 44498. So the first thing we're going to do is ensure that there is actually a listen on these ports on that machine. And we can use the netstat utility to do this. We'll issue a netstat-an, and we're going to pipe this through grep. On a Windows machine, you do find string or find str. So we're going to grep for, first, the naming service port. And we see here what we need to look for is a listen. This is the important thing. Since the publish address we're using is the default of all, it will show the listening interface as 0.0.0.0. The next thing we're going to check is whether or not there's a listen for the GUI server, and this is on port 44498. And we can see here that there is in fact a listen on all interfaces for the endpoint for the GUI server. So the next thing we need to do is pop over to our client, in this case my Windows 7 machine, and I'm going to open a command prompt. Now from here I'm going to use the telnet utility to telnet to these specific ports. If you don't have the telnet utility installed, if you get command not found, there's an easy way to install the telnet utility. I'll reference a knowledge article later that includes the instructions how to do this. Assuming it's installed, what we're going to do is we're just going to telnet to this endpoint. So the name of our host we're going to test first is the naming service. So it's WLA con-RH space and then the port name. It's 13077. Now, if the telnet works, we do expect to see this blank screen. This means that a connection has been established. What we do to get out of this and back to the prompt is we hit Control right bracket, the character next to the backslash on the US English keyboard, and then we're at the telnet prompt, and here we can type quit. That brings us back to the DOS prompt here. The next thing we need to do is test the other endpoints. In this particular case, we're going to test the GUI server endpoint, which is at port 44498. We should see the same results. Okay, so what we have here is, again, the blank screen, which indicates that the connection was a success. We're going to Control right bracket, and we're going to quit. Now, what we don't want to see is something other than a blank screen. If we get a message like connection refused, no route to host, connect failed, something like this, this indicates typically, if we've gone through the previous steps, that there's some sort of network device, some firewall, or some software that's involved between the 2 points that's preventing us from connecting. So what we can do is just test this out with some random port, and here is our error message. We have no listener on port 33333, so we've received a connection failed. So this is what it will look like if it does fail. Lastly, what we can do if we see everything working and our GUI is installed is we can actually run the orbadmin ns list utility from the client itself. To do that, we have to change directory to the installation of the Control-M Enterprise Manager client. And here I have it installed in this location, the VPN directory under Control-M EM8. We're in the bin directory, and then we run orbadmin ns list. And what we should see are results identical to that are provided on the server. And we can just spot check this really quickly. We can see that the host name is the same, WLA con-RH, and the port is the same, 44498. So these are the same results, and this is good. And consequently, our GUI will log in and connect if we want to. All right, so there's some basic troubleshooting for us. Very handy. I'm going to close out here and pop back my presentation. The next scenario that I want to discuss is using a single client installation to connect to multiple enterprise managers. A lot of people out there have, for example, a dev, test, and prod EM. Now you can use a single client to connect to these. The biggest caveat here is that the fix pack on the client matches that on the EM server. If you don't, there are some incompatibility issues that exist if you're using a higher level of the client than of the server, and vice versa. So we would encourage you to use the same fixed packs on the client and server. If you don't, you always do have the option of installing additional clients and having them at different fixed pack levels. So I'm going to pop over to my screen and give a quick demonstration of configuration for multiple environments. And for this, I have my Enterprise Manager GUI open. Now this is what's presented when you first launch the GUI, and we can see here an environment dropdown. By default, we have only one environment defined, and that is our default naming service. To connect to different environments, what we do is we select the plus button here, and then we type in the name of our Enterprise Manager environment. We'll call this prod. Type in the name of the naming service that's providing all of the registration for the servers, and then the port. The default port is 13075. I'm going to leave it there. We have the option of automatically detecting or selecting a specific server that is registered in the naming service that would show up in an orbadmin NS list output. We typically suggest leaving this to automatically detect, but if you have a particular reason, if you have different GUI servers running for specific purposes or to serve specific people, you can always suggest that. We've added the prod. We're going to add another one. We're going to call this dev, and it's at the same host. And we're going to select OK. So now, all we need to do to log into these different environments is essentially select the item in the environment dropdown, and we can see that the environment here changes, and you can log in accordingly. Now, I'd like to also say that there are a couple of other ways to do this. If you want to get more involved, the command line, the emwa.exe, can also be launched with command line arguments. You can get a list of the command line arguments by actually executing the emwa with /?, and what you can do there is provide login details, the name of the naming service, the name of the GUI server, etc. There's also a knowledge article, which I will reference later, that has some useful information for using the client install in situations where you, for example, are on Citrix environments or VDI, or a client that's being utilized by multiple people essentially at the same time. There are ways to do wrappers and set environment variables to basically bypass the creation or selection of the environments in this interactive way. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity real quick to review what we had done in troubleshooting. To start, if you're having problems with the client connecting to the server, the first thing we're going to do is go over to the server, run the orbadmin NS list utility, make sure that the naming service is on the particular host name that you think it is, that it's running at the port you are, and then gather the information regarding the endpoints. If it's the WA GUI that you're using, it's going to be the GUI server that you're going to be concerned with the endpoint, the GSR. If it's the CCM that's having a problem, you're going to be interested in the endpoint for the CMS or the configuration server. Once we have those endpoints on the server, we're going to use the netstat command to verify that there is a listen for each of those endpoints and that those servers aren't erroneously registered. We can clean them up if they are. Once we verify that there is a listen on the server, we go over to the client and we run the connectivity test, preferably using Telnet. We make sure that we're able to establish a connection. If we aren't, we need to go to the networking people and have them investigate it. If we are, our next step or our last step is to go to the bin directory on the client and run that orbadmin NS list. Make sure it shows up the same as it did in the server. Once you've had an opportunity to do that, or if you haven't, or if you don't have time to do that, and you need to reach out to support, some useful information for us would include whether or not this is a new installation, or if this was working in the past, perhaps what's changed. Also, what's useful is whether or not this is impacting all of your clients, all of your PCs, or only a specific set. And the same with the users. Does this login problem or connectivity problem impact all of your logins or only specific ones? For example, local users, LDAP. Gives us a head start if you can verify that you've done some initial testing with the connectivity. And lastly, we would generally appreciate the EM data collector, which will give us a lot of environmental information. It'll give us the orb admin NS list information, it'll give us your config XML, etc. And then the logs from the client are always useful in troubleshooting the client connectivity as well. The useful KAs, which I've been tempting people about, you can see these on this list. We talk about several of the items that I've demonstrated in the scenarios. They're run through in these KAs. The knowledge article regarding the Citrix environment and the wrappers to the launching the GUI. There's another knowledge article which discusses some issues which you may encounter if you have a particularly slow remote connection. So, very handy. At this point, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day and attending. I hope what I have presented is useful. We would encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook and BMC communities. BMC communities in particular is a place where users can speak with each other, post questions about best practices and whatnot. It's a very good place to go. You can link off of this from the www.bmc.com site. Would encourage you to go there. And lastly, our recordings for our webinars are posted on YouTube and iTunes. Some of our recent topics include PeopleSoft, self-service, auto-edit variables, and so forth.